Tonight, we have a moderator who will be in conversation with Marjan Kamali. Her name is Kevis Brownson. Kevis is a longtime Alameda resident. She has a BS in Bioresource Sciences from UC Berkeley. She's retired from a career as an agricultural specialist where she inspected ships and cargo for invasive species, plant pests, and animal diseases. And she's now pursuing a lifelong interest in art, literature, and music. She's volunteered in many organizations, including the American Association of University Women, Frank Bett Center for the Arts, Northern California House Concert Hosts, Friends of the Alameda Free Library, and the League of Women Voters. She's hosted an annual author event named the Alameda Author Series, sponsored by the AAUW and Friends of the Alameda Free Library. So welcome, Kevis, to our Friends at Home event. You can take it from here.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you, Karen and the friends. I am excited to be introducing our author today. Marjan Kamali is the award-winning author of The Stationery Shop, a national bestseller, and Together Tea, a Massachusetts Book Award finalist. Marjan has lived in 7 countries, and her novels are published in more than 20 languages. She's a 2022 recipient of the National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship. And now, welcome, Marjan.
Thank you so much, Kevis. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you all for tuning in.
Oh, it's great to have you here, Marjan. I think that we can launch right in. The Stationery Shop has gotten a lot of attention, and you might want to go with a little introduction of the book first.
Sure, absolutely. The Stationery Shop is my second book, and you're right, it's gotten a ton of attention, more than I ever dreamed could be possible. It's a love story, and I think when it came out 3 years ago and now also, people are hungry for just a good old-fashioned love story. It's about 2 teenagers who meet when they're 17 in Tehran, and they have a whirlwind romance and are all set to get married. But then, as fate would have it, they're separated and they miss seeing one another. They don't find one another until they reunite more than 60 years later in Massachusetts.
Well, I have to say that that it really was an ambitious project to deal with all those time periods, very complicated, different political events playing a part in this story, although not the main point of the story. Did you always know that your book, your love story, would span different eras, or did that develop over time?
You know, I didn't know much when I started the first draft, but I did know that they were going to be separated. I knew I wanted to write a book about lost love as much as first love. And I knew also that I wanted the backdrop to be 1953 in Iran, because I was shaped so much by the 1979 revolution that happened when I was a child. But whenever I spoke about the 79 revolution, people of my parents' generation would say, oh, you have no idea what we went through in 1953. And so I realized I have no idea what went on in 1953. And I deliberately set the book then so that it would force me to do the research and learn about the coup that happened then.
Well, I think that you evoked those different time periods very in very interesting ways. I was especially struck by how many different senses you use in your descriptions of how a smell or a taste can evoke a memory, even how objects are lined up. For example, though Roya has lived in the US for many decades, a visit to a shop transports her back to Iran. Did you want to read a passage about the American part of her life?
Yes, you know what? I'm going to read a passage that's from very close to the beginning of the book in chapter 1. And it's basically, we open the book when Roya is 77, and she is reconnecting again for the first time in 60 years with her fiance, whom she lost when she was 17. So I'll just dive right in with this passage. By now, Roya Archer was almost American, not just by marriage, but by virtue of having been in these United States for over 5 decades. She could remember a childhood spent in the hot and dusty streets of Tehran, playing tag with her little sister Zari, but her life now was carefully enclosed in New England with Walter. One visit to one shop a mere week ago to buy paper clips had cracked everything open. Once again, she was mired in 1953. Cinema Metropole in the middle of Iran's largest city that contentious summer. The red circular sofa in the lobby, over which a chandelier's crystals glistened like tears, smoke from cigarettes floated in wisps. Up the stairs and into the movie theater he had led her, and there on the screen, stars with foreign names caressed each other. After the film, he had walked with her in the summer twilight. The sky was lavender and layered with shades of purple so varied they seemed impossible. He had asked her to marry him near the jasmine-soaked bushes. His voice cracked when he said her name. They had exchanged countless love letters, planned their union, but in the end, nothing. Life had pulled out from under her everything that they had planned.
Oh, thank you. That was lovely. Besides the memory, it seems as if a lot of the characters, not just Roya and her beau at the time, had thwarted ambitions, thwarted plans. The events would come along and change things. The female characters had high hopes for going into science and doing ambitious kinds of roles that were not open to women in the past. And I just wondered what you might have thought about thwarted plans and how that affects us.
Yes, it's one thing to write about thwarted ambitions and plans for women in 1953 in Iran, but I think that basically the entire thrust of what I was trying to show was how sometimes we have these dreams, these plans that we think are our destiny, but life definitely for Roya has other plans. And for women of her generation, especially in Iran, there was a lot of pressure because if you were in the middle class, upper middle class, with all these new educational opportunities opened up to you, for you to not take advantage of them would seem almost selfish. But at the same time, despite all her plans for a career, for her education, Roya's true love was this person, Bahman, with whom she had planned an entire future. And I think at one point in the book, I've written, she expected to hear his voice every day of her life. And in the end, she ends up missing hearing his voice for 60 years until she hears it again once they're reunited. So I think one thing I was trying to show was that our thwarted plans, the plan Bs that happen in our lives, are just as good and just as viable, just as rich, and perhaps satisfying as the plan As. Lord knows Roya did not get to live her plan A. She had a plan B that was thrust upon her once plan A was thwarted, and you could argue plan C and D, but her coming to terms with that is a huge part of the arc of her story.
Yeah. Well, as a daughter of one of three daughters in my family, so no sons. I really felt that my father's support was very, I mean, he was so much like a character in your story. You can be anything you want, right? Similar to Roya's father. And I wondered about our father's encouragement in terms of being women and allowing us to realize, if not the dream that we originally thought of, but another dream, and how that affects us. What you thought about father.
I think it shapes us as women greatly, especially because um, I think we could argue so many cultures are patriarchal. I would argue Iran in 53 certainly was. For Roya to have had a father who encouraged her in this way, who wanted her to get educated, who wanted her to have a viable career of her own, and who pushed her, was a blessing and a privilege, and also an enormous pressure, which is something I'm trying to show. And especially when we read about fathers in cultures like Iran, we assume, just because of stereotypes, that a lot of those fathers are against their daughters' pursuit of career and education. But I deliberately wanted to show Roya's father as being quite progressive in those realms, because he's based in large part on my mother's father, who would have been around the same age at that time, and who was, for all intents and purposes, a feminist. I think to have the kind of father who believes in you is an enormous blessing. Not everybody, especially women, are privy to that. They don't get to have that. And it can make all the difference in the world to have a man in your corner, because sometimes that's what it takes. That's what it takes in a society that values the opinions and thoughts of men more than women.
Oh, thank you. So, uh, there's an interesting contrast between the falling in love kind of love and the friends that become affectionate and loving and supportive, as Walter was for Roya, but not always, in terms of jobs and things like that. But they still have different goals and ambitions, but it's in several places. This kind of affection is shown between different characters, and I wondered if you are trying to kind of contrast these things, or it was, or the vividness of that memory coming back of a previous time, and that first love was so poignant, I thought, of it coming full circle.
Yeah, the different kinds of love that we experience are definitely something I wanted to show. Obviously, we have Roya fall in love for the first time, madly, deeply, crazily, the way one does when one is 17, perhaps, and very young. And that's the love she has for Bahman. And because it's thwarted, as you say, maybe in her mind it becomes idealized for 60 years. And later in the book, this is no secret, we open the story with Roya married to her husband, Walter, and they've been married for many decades. And a lot of times when this book is being discussed, readers, are on Team Bahman or Team Walter. Some deem the first love she had for Bahman as the more exciting, intense, passionate love. And then the love for her husband is a steadier, kind of quieter love. Maybe so, perhaps, but I don't feel either love is superior. I think the love she has for her first love is quite valid and strong. Clearly, there was something there that allows her to carry it within herself, despite herself, all these years. But Roya's love for Walter, for her husband, is just as strong, in my opinion, just as deep, just different. And I think it is possible, and maybe we'll get into trouble for saying this. I don't think we have one soulmate in this world. I think we're capable of loving different people, and different people can be our soulmates depending on the shared history. She loved Bahman and she loves Walter, and it's possible to love the both of them. And I also think, as you know, Kevis, I've tried to explore different kinds of love, such as sisterly love, mother-child love, all those different familial loves in the book too.
Yes, the two sisters were so close, yet just like sisters, they had many, many fights. And I thought that illustrating that, how sisters can be both close and very different, and was really special. As I said, I had two sisters, and it just is a really special relationship. Um, okay, so well, the book is called A Stationery Shop, and I think there's a good reason for that. It had a really special place in the Roya and Bahman's love, and in the center of the story, and centered so many characters centered on that. So I think you had a passage that concerned the meaning of the stationery shop.
Yeah, so basically the story, yeah, you're right. It's called The Stationery Shop, which, by the way, wasn't my initial title for the story. I had a different title when I sent it to my editor, but it ended up being called The Stationery Shop. And it was one of those things where once it happens, you think, how could it be called anything else? I can't even imagine. I didn't think of that as the title. Roya and Bahman meet in a stationery shop in Tehran, and it's there in this stationery shop that their love blossoms, and that they continue to meet and get to know one another. And those of your, the people in your audience who've read the book know that the stationery shop holds significance in America as well. I don't want to give any spoilers, but let's just say it comes back in the story. But I'd love to read for you a passage from the book. This is early in the book. This is when, as a reader, you first encounter the stationery shop. So it's the introduction of the stationery shop. Roya's favorite place in all of Tehran was the stationery shop. It was on the corner of Churchill Street and Hafez Avenue, opposite the Russian embassy and right across the street from her school. Roya loved running her fingers over tablets of smooth pages in that shop. She loved the boxes of pencils that smelled like lead and promised knowledge. She could spend an entire afternoon just looking at fountain pens and ink bottles, or flipping through books that spoke of poetry and love and loss. The shop was simply called the Stationery Shop, no fancy name to it, but it was a bookstore as much as a stationery store. As the political divisions deepened that winter and hot-headed people engaged in debates and demonstrations all over the streets, it was the perfect retreat of quiet and learning. It was a sanctuary of calm, never overlit, never loud.
Sorry about the disturbance. Forgot to turn off my machine. So what struck me about this is the other stationery shop that you talked about, and how it was the objects lined up. I mean, sometimes we think of smells, sometimes we think of a sound. A sound can trigger things, but in this case, it was the way pens were lined up that brought her back to this very special place that had that so much of the book was about, and the characters intersected in very many ways. What was your experience of stationery shops, and
Oh,
how did you decide that they would meet in this kind of environment?
well, you know what? As you can guess, I love stationery shops. I grew up going to stationery shops. And when I was little, even as a child in Iran, I would always go to the stationery shop in my neighborhood. And in Tehran, the stationery shops are stationery shops and also bookstores. So they'd be selling books, they'd be selling colored pencils, they'd be selling erasers and ink bottles and fountain pens and notebooks. It was literally my favorite place. To this day, anytime I visit anywhere new, I first find out if there's a stationery shop and then I go to it. I'm not talking Staples, no, nothing against them, but I'm talking the small, independently owned stationery shops. And for example, just last week, I was in Florence in Italy, and I stumbled upon a tiny stationery shop in the center of like the old town. And I went in, and it was gorgeous with just like the marbled paper, all the handmade Italian stationery. And I said to the owner, I said in English, I wrote a book about a stationery shop in Tehran, and I love stationery shops. And he smiled at me, and he was Iranian. He said he was Iranian. So it was one of those moments, Kevis, because now you've read the book, the stationery shop reappears in America. Well, it was reappearing for me as the author in Italy, and we had a nice conversation. So I'm in love with stationery. School supplies are my favorite thing.
I have to confess, I'm a bit in love with stationery shops as well, and it's kind of a tragedy that they've disappeared. There was one right here in Alameda that was walking distance from my house, and I just love to go in there and look at all the beautiful things that they had.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then the other thing that is so evocative in your book is the descriptions of the food, and it just made me want to go out and cook Persian food. Just it sounded so wonderful. In There's a wedding or an engagement party feast that the Roya's mother was preparing for an engagement party that she had, and there was a reference in the book that Roya's mother was going a little bit all out, that this was like not expected, all the things that she was preparing. And I was wondering if that was truly like too far, or if it was something that most mothers would be like, oh, I want everything to be just perfect.
You know what? I think it wouldn't have been too far to go all out and to prepare a feast, because the truth is, in a lot of Persian get-togethers, the feast is key. And especially when you have guests, you put out the best you have, you over prepare, you make more dishes than anyone could possibly finish. So, in that sense, it wasn't over the top. What was over the top in the engagement party Roya's mom prepares for her daughter Roya is that she makes a dish called jeweled rice, shirin polo, which normally is reserved for weddings, not engagements, weddings. It's a wedding dish. And so by creating this colorful, flavorful, traditional wedding dish, did she in some way jinx? Because now we know they never did get married. So that's why I said it was over the top, because she includes that particular dish. But the food, to your point, I get so many messages from readers. I get lovely emails, direct messages on Instagram, particularly. And I will tell you, I get asked for recipes a ton. Uh, there is a huge appetite for the recipes. And we're lucky now because there's so many great Persian food blogs online, and there's so many great Persian food accounts on places like Instagram with colorful, gorgeous photos and step-by-step instructions. So you can cook the Persian food if you wish.
That's wonderful. That yeah, I read somewhere you referenced one called the Persian Kitchen, which is easy to
Mhm.
remember. So I looked that one up because I was just like, oh, I can't wait to try making some of these things. But I'm sure yeah, it would take years of practice. But that you brought up a good point about well, the evil eye or fate or bad luck, or there are a lot of instances of something happening, someone taking some action, and then and then maybe something might have gone the wrong way because of it in people's minds, and they're doubting themselves and wondering about it too. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. It's such a constant thread in the Persian culture and in so many cultures. I've talked to readers who are Turkish, readers who are Greek, readers, from so many different ethnicities and backgrounds, who Italian, who have this concept of the evil eye that has been inculcated into them since birth, as it has with me. I envy haha, envy with the evil eye. But truly, I envy anyone who wasn't brought up with it, because I feel like perhaps you're liberated from this worry. The evil eye is this belief that if you are too happy, if you're too successful, if you're too good looking, too rich, too anything positive, people will jinx you. They'll jinx you because they're envious. And it's this belief that envy has energy. The energy is given through the eye of the envious, jealous person, so evil eye. And there are all kinds of protections that are superstitious. I'm sure you've seen the literal blue eye that's so common in shops in Turkey and the Middle East. And I know my author friend who's of Italian heritage, she carried something in her keychain and all of that. But the evil eye is a thread throughout this book. And Roya and Bahman are pretty darn happy when they first have their courtship. And there's this sense in the air that they're too perfect. And will fate pull out from under them this happiness? And it does. So I'm always exploring the evil eye in my work, and I'm always fighting the urge to believe in it in my daily life.
Well, I'm here to tell you I don't think of myself as superstitious. In the culture I was raised in, there isn't this concept exactly the same, but there's always a sense of foreboding when there's like an indecisive moment or something that is a little bit not customary. Um, and then something happens and there's that self-doubt. So I can only imagine, if it's such a strong thread, how much that affects what people do or don't dare to do. And what I was really interested in too in this period was okay, so women were free in 1950s to go ahead and get rid of some of the strictures about dress and the way that they should behave and what they could do, like I don't know, going to dance parties. There was a lot of dancing going on, and I just wondered what the cultural what that might, I know you weren't there, but what that might have felt like to people. I mean, maybe your family telling you about it.
You know,
Um,
it's very interesting in countries like Iran and Afghanistan, where women had more rights decades ago than they do now, where the rights went backwards. Um, I do feel also it's a bit of a warning because at the height of Iran's quote unquote westernization, at the height of its modernization in the 70s, the last country in the Middle East that people thought would become so strict and a religiously fundamentalist country, or maybe I should say ruled by a religious fundamentalist government, was Iran, because it was at that time so westernized and progressive, and especially women's dress is just a good symbol of how to measure that level of fundamentalism in the government. And now it's gone back. And, you know, I'm of the belief personally that if a woman chooses to wear hijab, to cover herself, to cover her hair, she should have that choice. And if she chooses not to, that too should be her choice. That's just my personal opinion. But in Iran, it became the law. And once it became the law, it created all kinds of strife and struggle to this day. Like literally right now, there's a huge situation with the rules of hijab in Iran. For women like my mother's generation who grew up very differently, it's difficult to see rights taken away. And you know, the hijab is symbolic, you see it, it's very visible, but other rights were taken away, much more important rights like inheritance rights, child custody when a woman gets divorced, all kinds of reproductive rights, marriage laws were, in a way, the clock went back in time. And so it's sobering. And we see it happen in Afghanistan for sure. And I think people won't believe me if I say you never know where it's going to happen. No one thought it could happen in Iran, and it did. So it's just, it's sobering.
yes, yes. Yeah, I just beyond the rights, I thought it was. I mean, of course, here we're going through a time. We're going through a time of turmoil, and which is very evocative of similarly of the period that you depicted in and so it struck me that that at the same time people were living their lives and trying not to think about these things and of course, there's a bit of tension of what can you do in this period and what can't you do from because of custom and the social classes issue as well. But they were having a lot of fun also. You know that whole it felt like heady freedom. You know of just the world opening up and yeah, so, and I feel like we went through that here to some extent, through different periods. I think there was, you know, early in the 20th century, there was a period and then a retraction and then on into the time period that I lived through in college. So I'm hopeful that this turmoil will pass, but yeah, things can change so suddenly. But speaking of those dance parties and tango and things like that, I mean, it seems as if in a country that had recently had some new rights for women, this would have been quite different to be able to get together in this way. I'm not sure. I don't know, I don't know that area of the world very well.
It was different and it was new and it was very much based on class and where you were in the country. So some of those scenes that I write about in the stationery shop where young people are getting together to dance the tango, or they're having these parties where they do the waltz, or they're having these amazing feasts and get-togethers and talking about what's currently out in the cinema, and publishing is blossoming, theater is blossoming, the art world is blossoming. It is specific to the big cities in Iran, and you certainly wouldn't have had that happening in the villages, which is part of the reason 25 years after 1953 there was a revolution, because there was this growing inequality in the culture, but also it was supremely specific to class. So the lower classes were struggling a great deal. They were not dancing the tango, but the classes I'm writing about are the middle to the upper middle class. And yes, there was this heady, almost dizzying, hedonistic situation with the young, because it was a good time to be young and it was a good time to experience this level of freedom if you were of that class and if you had the means and the privilege. So I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed a lot of the elders in my own family who lived through that time, and I wanted to hear their stories. And that's when I learned about how they did the tango and the waltz and the parties and what they called ball masquerades, which were these masquerades where people would dress up. And, looking back on it from where we sit now, it sounds a little bit magical and glamorous, but I'm very aware that it was that way, but for a select group of people in the country and for a select section of society. So all of that is going on in the stationery shop, and also the cafe culture, which I had a lot of fun doing interviews about the cafe culture, because it astounded me how much people who had lived through that time wanted me to know what specific pastries were served and how the coffees were made. And I put all that in the book because I could tell it really mattered.
Well, that is amazing because the elephant ears, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to go have one of those, right? Yeah. So of course, Roya and her sister are able to study here in the United States in that time period. I happened to be at UC Berkeley during the later period, 1979, is actually starting 78. I was staying in a huge apartment building, but I was surrounded by other students from Iran. There were just so many, and they made tea for me, and it was just very interesting talking to them going through that period. And so is that the period where you were talking about later about being not necessarily involved, but conscious of the events in Iran? I'm not sure where you were.
Yeah, I mean,
how that affected you. Yeah.
It culminated in 1978, 79, the revolution that we all now are, I think, familiar with. But in 1953, that was the beginning of programs between the US and Iran for educational exchange. And I specifically had Roya, after her heartbreak, after she's not able to really connect with Bahman, we won't get into the details, but the horrific thing that happens to set them apart. Roya and her sister moved to Mills College in California, right near Berkeley. And I went to Berkeley too, by the way, so go Bears. But I deliberately had Roya and Zari go to Mills College because that's based on a real program. Mills College had a program specifically for Iranian women to come from Iran. And one of the aunts in my family was one of the first women from Iran to come to the US to study. And then that became very commonplace, such that by the period you're talking about, 78, 79, the largest number of foreign students, the country that had the largest number of foreign students in the US was Iran. And then a lot of them were here to study with the intent of going back. But then when the revolution happened, many of them were sort of stuck and didn't go back or couldn't go back. So that was the beginning of that whole other post-1979 revolution period, which saw the biggest wave of Iranian immigrants to the US. Up until then, immigrants from Iran had come in order to come and study and leave. Like, it wasn't as common to come and stay. But then the 79 revolution changed everything.
Yeah, I really sort of followed this revolution through, in the rise of Khomeini, and I remember one of them saying to me, "Well, the in the cities they don't understand what's going on, but people in the rural areas, they think that the Ayatollahs are going to save them." Basically, and yeah, it was a very different thing. I just have one more question, then we'll go to Q&A. And this is about mental illness. One of the characters is very affected by mental illness, and there's such a stigma, and yet mental illness plays a part in the story in terms of it sort of being used for to change people's minds, and affect how others in that person's lives relate to each other and the choices that they make. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about the stigma of mental illness today, then, and how people deal with it and how it affects their lives.
Yeah, I mean, there's less of a stigma today than there was then, but I can guarantee you that in 1953 in Iran, there was a huge stigma with mental illness. And people were often not diagnosed, let alone treated. And I really wanted to explore mental illness because I feel like it runs on a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, you have people with a very pronounced mental illness. They may be diagnosed and treated today. But on the other end of the spectrum, even today, you have people who are high functioning, but who do suffer from a personality disorder. And this personality disorder is often not diagnosed, certainly not treated. And it can create so much harm for that person themselves and also for the people they love. And in the Stationery Shop, Bahman, our hero, deals with the mental illness of his mother, which those in your audience who've read the book know ends up having such great ripple effects. But I really wanted to explore how when it's not being medically attended to, the onus is on the family members to handle it. And so Bahman is constantly trying to take care of his mother who's mentally ill, and he's constantly trying to overcompensate for the things she says, the things she does, as is his father. And that's something I'm very familiar with. I grew up knowing that mental illness had a huge stigma. I grew up with a family member in my own family who had mental illness. I was constantly asking questions about her, and I was always told it can't be helped. That's just how she is, which may be true, but it was just something you didn't talk about, which is why I really wanted to write about it.
I'm so glad you did. There's so many of us who have this situation, and especially the overcompensating situation where if one has a family member, then one is always trying to like, okay, how am I going to manage this situation? How am I going to manage it and take care of things and try to smooth things over and make everything function the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to go now to the chat and see what questions we have. This is from one of our audience. Says, I was interested in the flashback to the early 1900s to the youth who ultimately became the owner of the stationery shop. How did you come to the idea of giving those, working in that time period?
Yeah, I wanted to have a subplot, and we have a plot, obviously, which is that Roya and Bahman fall in love, and then due to circumstances beyond their control, circumstances which the reader learns of as they are uncovered, they're separated, and then they reunite, and we see what happens after that. But I wanted a subplot that involved the same theme of lost love, but obviously it couldn't be with Roya and Bahman. And so the stationery shop owner has his own past, and he has his own lost love. And as I wrote the character of Bahman's mother, initially she was very much a stereotype. In the first draft, she was this kind of villainous mother-in-law type who thinks her son walks on water and can do no wrong. But then as I developed her character, I realized she has her own past, her own losses, many losses, her own traumas, and her own mental illness that is triggered by trauma. And so that's how that developed. It's not something I can even explain. It just was this sort of magical discovery for me as well, where I was surprised by that backstory.
Thank you. So we've got a question about the process of, well, it's a two-part question, but first of all, is there any chance of turning this book into a movie? And I think there was some interest in maybe a mini-series, and I wondered how that process, where you were, what's going on with that, and how that came about.
Yes, well, the book has been optioned by HBO to be turned into a TV series. It's currently on hold because of the Warner Brothers Discovery Channel merger. A lot of shows you may have read, even ones that have been cast and shot and finished, maybe on the chopping block. This project was just beginning to get off the ground, so I'm not quite sure where it stands. But I can tell you we have our producers attached and we have the screenwriter attached. And it's super duper exciting. And it was very exciting to be optioned by HBO. We'll see what happens. That part I'm not quite sure of yet. But, it's an adventure. When your book is optioned to be adapted to the screen, there's always, it's like it takes on a whole new life. But at the end of the day, the book is the book and will always be the book. And the screen adaptation is its own animal.
Oh, so very true. So what projects are you working on now? Do you have a book or anything else that is coming?
Well, I've been working on the next book, and so it's currently got the very sexy title of Novel 3. So I'm gonna have to come up with a better title. But yeah, Novel 3 is in the works, and I did finish the first draft. The way I work is I write the first draft in order to know what the story's about. And during that writing of the first draft, a lot changes. I started off writing a book and ended up writing an entirely different book. So I see in the chat, oh yes, I can give you a hint about the story of novel 3. It's a friendship story. It also takes place in Iran and the US. And I very much wanted to explore women's rights in the mid 20th century in Iran. I find, well, obviously in the Stationery Shop, I covered 1953 in great detail. I find the 60s and 70s in Iran, when the rights were increasing, were fascinating. And then they fell off the cliff in the late 70s, early 80s. So that's currently what I'm working on.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
So I wanted to thank you, Marjan, again for coming and being with us today. It's been so much fun. And if you haven't read her book, it's just such a story, and it'll make such a great movie, TV series, whatever it turns into, because I'm sure it will. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Manuel to take us. Friends have a few announcements, and thanks again, Marjan.
Thank you so much, Kevis. Thank you for this great conversation, and thank you to David and Karen and all the friends of the Alameda Public Library. It was a lot of fun to be with you.
Okay, see you again.